And we are plunging into 2025. New Year is traditionally the time when you reflect, adjust, commit to the tweaks in direction that show you're at least trying to learn from experience. I've been thinking about this channel and I'm taking on a refresh. I'm changing the byline for the channel, I'm sharpening the focus for the channel. Evolution rather than revolution, but change nonetheless. The previous byline, subtitled Dangerously Reasonable, was premised on this. Mallen looks at anything and everything that interests him about how the world is changing. That included a lot of stuff about the intersection between science and public policy. A lot of climate change, some geopolitics, some US and UK politics, ignoring the trivia, the day-to-day breathless coverage of who tweeted what and who was outraged about it, more focused on the things that seem most likely to be enduringly important. It was, in some ways, a rather passive perspective. Independent, fact-focused, non-ideological, all those good things, but passive. That passivity is going to change a bit. I said evolution. Because over the years of looking at stuff, I've been firming up a perspective of what's happening in the world that could be more proactively brought to bear on that analysis. And I've also been prone to some errors in focus, which I would like to correct. So let's deal with those in turn. I think if you analyse my videos over the last 5 years, the themes they deal with and the arguments they explore, you'd be pretty well able to pull together my emerging perspective on the rapidly changing world that we live in. One of those significant changes is the apparent reality of democratic decline. There are a number of factors coming together to create that decline. The quality of political leadership has fallen precipitously in recent years. Side by side with that, the power of governments to actually make a genuine difference has eroded, even as the expectations of the public as to what they should be able to do has gone exponentially upwards out of sight. Bloated bureaucratic states caught in groupthink have reached the point of inducing action paralysis. They are unresponsive to political need, failing chronically to deliver basic services expected of the state, while simultaneously consuming vast quantities of resources and piling up national debt to do so. This is the genuine deep state, not to be confused with the conspiracy theory version. It is the result of a system in decay, made up of people following the most obvious short-term incentives and losing sight of the intended mission statement. And that is just the stuff that we're doing to ourselves. At the same time, the effectiveness of disinformation campaigns by some of the enemies of democracies have become increasingly effective at destabilising the democratic process. Indeed, we might start at this point to wonder whether the actual process of democracy is on course to be rendered unviable by the evolution of these strategies. It is a possibility. It comes along with the rise of authoritarian states, reshaping the world along the might makes right principles. This dangerous world is empowered by more unpredictable and lethal warfighting technologies and a more fragile and vulnerable environment. For example, our societies right now are wholesale moving every physical process into digital processes. Money, supply chains, manufacturing, shopping, relationships, everything is moving online. Very convenient, but leaving them highly vulnerable to disruption by hacking, by infrastructure attacks, and by external events, like, for instance, a solar super flare that would devastate our societies in ways that had never been possible before. Also, of course, the consequences of climate change are being felt and will become more and more of a background factor, leading to additional unpredictability and potential crisis moments and geopolitical conflict. because the developed world is in the process of giving up even promising to think about the demands of a developing world in paying for them to cope with the impacts of climate, and there will be a backlash. But at the same time, the genuine essential value and reputation of science is being undermined. It's being undermined by politicization, where politicians and campaigners misuse or misrepresent it. It's being undermined by scientific fraud, and also by political activism by a minority of scientists. And those things combined leave it more vulnerable to outright conspiracy nonsense, which is building credence off the back of the erosion of trust and credibility in science. But it is more important than ever that we have the best intelligence on what's actually happening in the world. We need good science more than ever before, because we've grown to the point where we do now have genuinely global problems. Certain mistakes we might choose to make could now scale extremely rapidly with major consequences. The challenge we have is that our governance structures are making themselves incapable of responding to even local problems, let alone global ones. Proposals put forward by some for new structures for global governance are almost certainly even worse, incompetently conceived as they are. And as mentioned before, the caliber of our political leadership is now so low that we follow patently stupid policies that are pretty much designed to fail. This happens largely because those policymakers seem to have lost the basic skills for trade-offs and recognizing realities on the ground for the people who elect them and who are going to be affected by their policies. This includes all those technocrats, the self-identified smartest people in the room, the people who really go to the World Economic Forum, which is, after all, just a think tank where ideas get discussed and spread. The problem with the WEF isn't that it's taking over the world, it's that it collects together many of the richest, the most successful, the tech bros, the world leaders, the academics. And what comes out at the end is largely bland and fails to provide real answers. You know, it's not even now about globalism versus anti-globalism. You have to ask what those labels actually mean anymore. At one level, pretty much everyone is a globalist now. Trump certainly is, regardless of the language of tariffs and protectionism. Because the world is small, the economic systems are global, the problems hence are increasingly global as well. Very few thought that the answer to that was global government. Right now, even fewer still hold to that idea. It was more in vogue when you had confident national leaders who felt that they were the wave of the future, the Blairs and the Clintons. Now you have leaders seeing themselves failing, seeing the rise of populists to depose them, worried that they're in a game that is rigged against them and they just don't know how to win it. Arguably, this is one reason why 2024, the year with the most elections worldwide, showed this major trend towards electoral volatility and anti-incumbency. People are seeing relative economic decline, and this changes mindsets. When people were used to growth, their expectation was that they would become wealthier in time than their parents were. Now, as growth is low, they are imbued instead with what's described as a zero-sum mindset, that for anyone to win, others have to lose. Success is only at the expense of someone else, and that's a change that makes it harder for any system to work effectively. So an erosion of their living situation and mindset, the rise of factors such as routine crime, excessive immigration, changing the nature of their communities, these are feeding that zero-sum mindset even more. And the mentality has been particularly sharp for younger men, who have seen themselves to be the target of the woke cultural movements and feel that the progression of more favoured groups is all at their expense by design, because it's not just about advancing those other groups, but specifically about punishing them and keeping them down. Hence why we've seen an unprecedented shift in the political affiliations of younger people, with men and women diverging sharply in their preferences. The upshot of all of this is that the electorate have reached the point where they will just keep punishing whoever's in charge until someone actually succeeds in sorting these things out. And increasing numbers who feel themselves at the wrong end of the zero-sum equation are attracted to candidates who promise to trash the existing system and to radically reshape it thereafter. However unlikely or unsuitable those candidates would have appeared during previous times. The fact is that many of these things probably could be sorted out if you had high caliber leaders able to make decisions, unbound by their own bloated bureaucracies, able to get basic things done. In other words, functional government. But in its absence, we have the danger that the autocracies will succeed in persuading people that it is democracy itself that has failed them, and they should willingly embrace their brighter and better alternative. Brighter and better until you actually get there, that is. So that's my summary of our current changing world faced with the reality of democratic decline, not yet sure how that's going to play out. What is the spirit and purpose of the channel, this channel, that seeks to analyse all that? 1. That is to provide analysis, not campaigning. That hasn't changed. 2. To continue to promote the value of truth. Yes, truth. In spite of what some people would have you believe, there is such a thing. It's not your truth and my truth. There is truth and there is falsehood or error. But what's the definition of truth, you ask? Well, something that accords with reality. It's not that hard, even though it's become contentious and a bit unfashionable to say so. As the great physicist Richard Feynman said, if your technology is not based on reality, it will fail, because nature cannot be fooled. This shouldn't be contentious, but it is. I mean, it really is. Decision makers go to great lengths to avoid unpalatable realities. And one of the principal realities they avoid is any real learning about how things get done. You'd think every politician would be studying history to understand what drives political success, in how to get things done and to make a difference. Dominic Cummings, the former head of the Brexit Vote Leave campaign, latterly the special advisor to Number 10, he makes the same argument. In a recent blog post, he repeated this. Almost nobody has any interest in general principles underlying success and failure, nor interest in execution, stroke management, and although political people read a lot of history books, it's hard to see any learning. If you don't follow strategies based on what has been shown to work in the past, you end up simply following the short-term incentives in front of you. And at best, that leads to the sort of cycles that Ray Dalio talks about, with the inevitability of the rise and fall of empires marked by predictable behaviours at different points in the cycle. Dalio's analysis is right, but I've increasingly concluded insufficient on its own, because short-term incentives are vulnerable to manipulation, because of the technology, because of the rise of post-truth autocratic disruption. What we're seeing in the modern world has features that disrupt Ray Dalio's predictability. All the more reason why we need to work a lot harder to understand what's going on, to be clearer and robust about what's being used against us. That's 2. 3. The next value and feature of this channel remains the same. Promote the values of respectful dialogue versus the cult dynamics of polarization. I remain relentlessly positive about people at an individual level, curious to learn from anyone, including people who I may not agree with on various matters. I aim to model kindness and generosity, not aggression or mean-spiritedness. This is at the heart of healthy democracies, to know that your political opponents are not your enemies, hence why the UK official opposition is labelled His Majesty's Loyal Opposition. We are all focused on a common goal, the best governance of the country on behalf of its people. The current discourse is corrosive of that, and part of a process of democratic decline. Part of the aim of strategic disinformation is to polarize and divide people because that destroys the foundations of democracy. Refusing to demonize your opponents, therefore, is an act of resistance against the attacks of our actual geopolitical enemies. 4. This channel will continue to promote universal principles around freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the importance of a politically independent judiciary, that all power should be held constructively to account, and that corruption should be exposed and resisted. These are all basic tenets of functioning, healthy democracies. They should apply, of course, to all sides equally. And the best political actors should be ready to call out the faults on their own side when they go egregiously wrong. I don't think having that as the bedrock turns it into a campaigning channel. Any analysis starts from some terms of references. Those are mine. 5. A value for this channel where I aim to do better than I have always managed in the past. An improvement for 2025. Given the above analysis of our changing world, I have often let myself get overly distracted by the temptation to refute nonsense. You know, there's a serious grown-up discussion to be had about, for instance, governance in solving global problems. But I would end up doing a video explaining why the World Economic Forum is not Klaus Schwab insisting that you should be forced to eat bugs or whatever. Likewise, a non-trivial portion of climate-related policy is terrible, badly conceived, doomed to failure, something that deserves constructive discussion. But I would end up explaining to people again and again and again why the cherry-picked graphs selected by fantasists didn't prove that the science of climate change is made up. It felt like debunking was an important thing to be doing because the public space seems to be awash with nonsense. But arguably, the more interesting discussion is the one that deals with reality as the starting point and the grey areas that exist there. To have a discussion with people interested in the truth of what's happening, not the keyboard warriors, which the product of which is the fire hose of bullshit that resists reality like oil resists water. Now, that doesn't mean taking mainstream narratives or any narratives uncritically. I am proud that on this channel I was exploring the evidence around the lab leak hypothesis, starting during the time when respectable outlets weren't touching it because Trump had said something about it, and therefore it was being held to be toxic. I am proud that on this channel I was exploring the issues around the policy instrument of lockdowns, looking at the arguments around the total lack of assessments around the cost of lockdown, looking to see what actual research there was or wasn't in support of the effectiveness of lockdowns in achieving their goal, and doing that again when it was highly controversial, when I started doing it anyway, less so today. I am proud that I talked about the clear evidence of Joe Biden's mental impairment right back in the 2020 election, and then particularly in his first foreign summit, the G7 meeting in Cornwall, because it has always been in plain sight, for all that some denied it, and because it matters. Low caliber of leadership. It matters. It mattered for Biden. Similar things will matter just as much or more for Trump, depending on what happens. The partisans can't be clear-sighted on such things, so a non-partisan view adds something to the mix, I would suggest. I did those things because if you're interested in what's true, you shouldn't be distracted by what's considered too taboo to talk about. And there are two main reasons why major gaslighting moments take place. One, mainstream media and commentators often reject valid arguments because they're adjacent to blatant nonsense, even though they are not themselves nonsense. Yes, some of the people who took those issues on, they launched them into the stratosphere and therefore damaged the cause of fearless inquiry, going on about bioweapons and Bill Gates and going on about lockdowns being the WEF and various anti-vax things, all the blathering nonsense. The difference was summed up in a single word: evidence. Just so you can use that principle to highlight how little of a nonsense has any evidence, which is what I did, or you can focus on what's really going on as supported by the evidence. And two, because there's always a campaign running. And in a way that didn't used to be the case, news outlets have increasingly signed up to the campaigns. Part of a pushback against questioning lockdowns was the view that this was an emergency situation, and hence we needed to pull together and not take the plane to bits after it's left the ground. Now, of course, that we did discover could be overridden by an even more fashionable campaign. Hence the nonsense, which again I called out at the time, of excusing public demonstrations sparked by the killing of George Floyd while decrying any similar gatherings for any other causes, such as protesting lockdowns indeed. COVID-19 mattered, unless you were protesting racism, it was suggested. There's one time when the media getting behind the national line is appropriate. An existential war, when your nation is fighting for its very survival, when you are literally being invaded by the enemy, which wants to replace your government, brutalise your people, rape the women, kidnap and assimilate the children. Yes, in a situation like that, free speech is on hold. Got it. The rest of the time, it's more important, not less, that ideas and proposals can be challenged, because you do better if you challenge and defeat weak ideas and proposals on their merit. I want to bring more of that to bear on the dominant ideas and the dominant narratives. As the saying goes, the main thing is to remember that the main thing is the main thing. So, for instance, looking into the future, I've already mentioned that a lot of climate policy right now is badly conceived, poorly framed, and or hopelessly executed. If we agree climate change is a key problem for the future, we should want the policy to be effective, to be supported by the population, and hence politically viable. Now, it's hardly the fault of those who the mainstream will dismiss as climate deniers, not a phrase I use, if they are the only ones holding some of those policies to scrutiny. Sure, their analysis is often wrong. It is in any case limited by the fact that their preferred alternative is to do nothing and pretend the problem just doesn't exist, which is not much use to us. But equally, a lot of the policies put forward are failing with the wider electorate because they are delusional and somebody should be challenging them. Delusional for the same reason why COVID policies were problematic. They were framed on a single variable, with no sense of recruitment of the population, no sense of actually having to win the argument in a free exchange of ideas, no sense of trade-offs, because such problems never come down to just one variable. Or else delusional because they're based on numbers that don't add up, are overly optimistic or indeed pessimistic, and they only need a poke to provoke them to fall down altogether. Why do we get into such a situation? Because increasingly, the debates we have are based on failing to deal with reality, something that both sides accuse the other of, but the framing of the debate is not anchored to the real world in the first place. We have to pretend the campaign maximalist position is the only one that can be discussed, because otherwise, somehow you're conceding defeat, giving the other side ammunition. Hence, we have to pretend, for instance, that net zero by 2050 is the only target that can be permitted. Anything slower than that is literally the end of the world. But then these conceits fall by default, because having set out such maximalist positions that could only be achieved by hyper-competent action, probably to the exclusion of many of the priorities, well, as we've noted, politicians are incompetent. They set targets and deadlines and then hopelessly fail to do the things you would need to do if you were serious about meeting them. So we hit those reality barriers by default, having failed to put in place a more practical program that would have been a more effective use of the time, one that can actually be delivered and sustained. It's hardly a more effective way of dealing with reality, setting big targets and then failing to meet them. All of this is my way of saying that I want this channel to have more laser focus on the issues that affect this fight for the future that is currently going on. Again, not as an active campaign. Understanding the truth will always be the most important thing, wherever that goes, but assuming that that will make a difference by default. Seeking to be the antidote to the spirit of the age, where strategic disinformation by enemy states is parasitically fed on by post-truth populists and aided by the self-serving lies of the mainstream media. So I need to change the identity of the channel to reflect that. Hence, Dangerously Reasonable is now gone. Too close to the highly opinionated frothing at the mouth types who claim to be the voice of reason while being anything but. And at the same time, slightly counterintuitively, it's too passive voice. Sounds like a contradiction, I know. So instead, I decided to go with Faultlines, the big tectonic plate issues that are shifting beneath our feet. Actively seeking those out. Some of them are to be found in the daily headlines, but a lot of them are not. So I guess the key difference will be that I won't necessarily wait for things to draw themselves to my attention. I will be more inclined to seek things out. I hope you will support this evolution and maybe even find the content here more useful and relevant to you in 2025. My thanks in particular to all of you who have been Patreon supporters of this channel during 2024. I hope that what I've talked about in this video will make you want to continue that support, or if you're not a member of the club yet, to begin supporting for 2025. Couldn't spend the time on this channel that I do without it. Happy New Year to you all. Let me know what you think about all of the thoughts in this video in the comments section below.